Welcome, folk sources. This is Fabric of Folklore, and I am your host, Vanessa Y. Rogers. So knowledge of other cultures helps us to become better people. We understand each other better. We become more empathetic, and in turn, we become kinder. So one of the reasons I think my own podcast is so awesome, if I can call my own podcast awesome, is because I think that learning about each other just makes us better humans. So you can pat yourself on the back for becoming a better human for listening to this show today. And I'm super excited about our guest today. His name is Jim Hindle, and he is a fascinating musician and writer. He has a background in archaeology, interpretation, and environmental campaigning, and has written a book about history and the environment. He has written about history and environment extensively. His newest book, which is a funder campaign at Indiegogo, The Shrine Way, looks at themes of faith and pilgrimage. It examines issues about what pilgrimage can mean and help to achieve. So it's part memoir and walks through the path he took in his book that followed the pilgrim to the shrine of Thomas Beckett, but also was once formed a highway to and from the coast.
That's right. Yeah, no,
to the sacred center of these isles. Is that right? Did I get all that correct? All right, great. And pilgrimages are a tradition of lots of different cultures. So I would like if you could just kind of walk us through what a pilgrimage is, because in my experience, I don't have a whole lot of experience with what pilgrimages are, except for I know that it's very important to the Muslim faith to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, and I know that a lot of churches will take pilgrimages to the Holy Lands. Christian churches will take pilgrimages to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, to walk the path of Jesus. But other than that, that's as far as my knowledge goes of pilgrimages. So if you could kind of give us a definition.
Well, I mean, a lot's been said and written about pilgrimage. They obviously go back a long way. They're clearly pre-Christian, as well as to do with the more modern faiths. Essentially, a pilgrimage is a walk with intent. It can be as simple as that. So you choose to do a walk, and then you can set some kind of intent, what you'd like to achieve, what you may like to reflect upon. That's one definition. Another definition is quite simple, is that a pilgrimage is it's a walk done with intent. It's a walk away from home that brings spiritual rewards. So it can be as simple as that. There's a huge body of law about pre-Christian pilgrimage. I only know a very little. I'm only really writing about my own experience and the things that have become important to me. And I've always been a keen long-distance walker, and at some point that became grafted onto a more formalized pilgrimage process.
So, I have a friend who did a trek from along the Pacific coastline of the United States. And so would that be considered a pilgrimage of sorts, since he didn't, I don't know that he necessarily had a destination.
Yeah, it depends how formal you want to make it, really. I mean, like I say, it's really any walk can be a pilgrimage if you choose to make it so. So in doing so, you're making that intent. You may happen to walk to a sacred site, so be it Mecca or Jerusalem or Rome or Santiago. There's all these places we can walk to. But essentially as well, you can make any place sacred by choosing to make it an important place to finish your pilgrimage. So they can be as simple as that. So that's the beauty of it for me, I find.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the more famous ones, pilgrimage?
Sure. Well, in Europe, in the Christian tradition, I mean, obviously, I say Europe, but Jerusalem, Santiago is obviously quite massive. Santiago de Compostela, that on the north coast of Spain, Galicia. So that's part of the reason that became important. So you have the shrine of St. James. That's quite an involved story in itself. But you have you have a lot of people going there from all over Europe, so that's a continual pilgrimage. People generally follow the Camino Frances, which is a route along the north coast of Spain.
Uh-huh.
So that is and has been and remains very popular. That actually came into its prominence in medieval times because at times the route to Jerusalem could be so hazardous, not just in the Holy Land itself, but throughout Europe. There are various kind of intermittent strifes going on. So it became safer to walk to Santiago. So that was a reason how that became as prominent as it did. Obviously, Rome. I'm writing about the Pilgrim's Way, which finishes in Canterbury. So Thomas Beckett, his shrine, that was said to be the second most popular in Christian Europe at one point. So those are some of the things.
So is Santiago the first one?
That's probably secondary to Jerusalem and potentially Rome. I'm not sure what the actual first most important pilgrimage in Europe was at that point, but I'm presuming Rome. So there are all these places. Obviously, we've got quite a few sacred sites in Britain as well. The first walk I did that became a pilgrimage for me was to Bath Abbey, and that was, in a sense, like seemingly coincidental. I didn't realise that walk finished at Bath Abbey, but when I got there, that was a really interesting experience, and for me, that's what grafted the process of pilgrimage onto walking. So I mean, the world is rich with sacred sites.
Tell us about your first pilgrimage that you weren't intending to walk to Bath Abbey, or you weren't intending it to be a pilgrimage?
I was intending to walk to Bath. It was the Cotswolds Way, which goes down the Cotswolds in sort of West England. That's about a week's walk. So for me, I mean, when I set out, that was like any other long distance walk. Great experience. When I got closer to there was actually a box in the woods that had a little notepad with all the different comments of various pilgrims, and pilgrims, everyone was saying, yeah, we've got to get to Bath Abbey. So I was walking really in ignorance to that particular route in the sense that it finished where it did. When I got to Bath Abbey, I mean, it's a really profound experience. I know something clicked in for me, and there was sort of no going back after that point. I was like, okay, I can see how these two traditions, if you like, can marry. So that was one experience.
What was profound about it?
I mean, obviously I was arriving in an established abbey, so it really brought to the fore feelings for me, thoughts I wanted to look at about my Christian upbringing. That's one of the themes I've helped explore in the book I've written. My kind of relationship to that has been one of the questions I've asked as I write the book, and that's fed a lot of research. For me, that's why a figure like Beckett became so interesting, because he had a very profound spiritual life, and that's a big part of his story. And but also, interesting questions about the degree to which he took that.
What a pilgrimage is. How far back do they date? You said they predate
ground.
Christian.
So these were some of the reasons I chose to write
Can you tell us a little bit about the history of pilgrimages?
The Pilgrim's Way in particular. To the best of my knowledge, I think my understanding is that this is something that goes back so far back into our collective history. It would be hard to pin on any dates or evidence. I've heard, people relate traditional law that pilgrimage was a very big factor in our ancestors' lives. So, clearly huge. The Pilgrim's Way, goes along an ancient ridge. So if you look at, there's a really good book by Philip Carr-Gomm, who I'm sure many of you will have heard of. He wrote a book called The Druid Way. One of the things he says in that book is that the Salisbury Plain is like the palm of a hand in southern England. So if you can envision that, and the different chalk ridges stretching out from that, spread out from Salisbury Plain like the fingers of a hand. And, it's thought, and there's a lot of archaeological evidence that people would travel along these ridges to the central heartland and uplands of southern England. So that's just one example. And, there's a lot of evidence of that en route. that's one example of how far these things can go back. These routes were the hilltops were kind of highways in a sense in southern England, because they were clear of a muddy ground, clear of a forest. The going was better. So, that led to Bronze Age, Iron Age, all these hill forts and shrines appearing along these ridges. There's been a lot written about that. So that's one example. But as I say, as my understanding is that pilgrimage is universal to all cultures, and goes back to our earliest days. And we were always, for a very long time, nomadic. So you had these traditions that people would travel their tribal lands, and connect up the places important to them. And for me, that's sort of been reflected in my own feelings since a young age, that part of the point of going on a long walk is to connect one place to another, without the kind of disruption of more modern means of transport. For me, that's always been quite profound. And when I have had the opportunity to walk to different places on foot, that's a very different experience than modern fast travel.
So how long would a pilgrimage take in general? I mean, I know that they vary from, path to path, but give us a range.
I mean, it's how long have you got? I mean, people can spend their whole lives in pilgrimage sometimes. I mean, there's a guy I was hearing about the other day, and he's been walking around the coast of Britain. So he's been doing that for the last 5 years. If you look at a continental pilgrimage, medieval times, people might walk to Santiago, for example. That could take months and months, and then you'd have to walk back again on the other side of that. So, people went to Jerusalem and stayed there. There's this huge body of kind of cultural cross-fertilization of all these people on the move, going to these sacred sites, maybe lingering somewhere, maybe taking on work. You get places like the cities in northern Spain, which have been deeply enriched by, many of the people passing through, as well as some of the different cultures who've come there for, different reasons. So it's an open-ended thing. People would often do one pilgrimage, even medieval times, and then start on another straight away. It became a kind of lifestyle. And if you look at the medieval period, pilgrims could, it was often one of the greatest opportunities of your lifetime for extensive and proper travel. So some people would just do that, and if they could carry it on, they would, because once you've moved on from your background, you could use the word, you could cut the ties with your background, but you've therefore got an opportunity to travel and see the world as it is. So I think there's no real limit to how long any pilgrimage can last.
And did people in the past, did they generally go in large groups, or did they go in just a family unit, or how would they travel?
Yeah, I think it varied. I mean, people could go individually. People often did travel in groups because, it's clearly safer, and sort of travel in medieval Europe was maybe a slightly different creature than it was today. So people would definitely travel, sometimes in moderate to large numbers. There's a place on the Pilgrim's Way, it's the final day's walk. It's before a wood called King's Wood, which apparently was frequented by vagrants, bandits. So the story goes. So there's an actual church near the entrance to King's Wood with a little porch with a kind of chimney. And the story goes that pilgrims would gather there and wait till they had a kind of band of numbers in which to travel through the woods, and thereby, help ward off any kind of bandits, so to speak. So that's one example. But yeah, certainly there'd be big groups. Yeah.
And where are people sleeping? How are people? Are they just sleeping on the side of the road? Are they sleeping in inns? Like, the ins and outs of this is very fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Obviously, you had all the monastic houses, which were a much bigger body, certainly in England, than they were post-Reformation. So there was a kind of hospitable, literally,
Mm-hmm.
tradition. So that was one thing. You had the inns as well, so that's a whole other subject area. Undoubtedly, people would camp. I think you look at the history of these places. There could be a very broad route. I mean, it's one of the kind of things about historiography of the route I've written about is that sometimes the antiquarians can be very fussy and go, okay, this route went specifically here and there, very, very particular. But if you look at the routes, I mean, pilgrims could travel, they wouldn't necessarily stick to a given path even. You look at places like on the towns that help form part of a route, so Dorking and Reigate and Guildford, for example. All those high streets measure up east to west. So that kind of indicates a likeliness that they were through roads east to west for the pilgrims.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was a combination of things, and undoubtedly people would sleep in the woods and be set
Mm-hmm.
up for that as well. So I think it did vary.
And then you said they would sometimes would take up work along the route.
Well, you can only imagine that if you're traveling somewhere for months at a time, and if
Right.
you've given up your previous work or said goodbye to your family, people would often kind of make their wills before they left to get all their worldly affairs in order. And then say you find yourself in southern France or northern Spain or Turkey, and you can only imagine that became a practical thing for some pilgrims to do, depending on funds.
Mm-hmm.
Modern times you see pilgrims who set up camp on the side of a road sometimes. So I can only imagine that would be part of the case for a good proportion of pilgrims doing that. I mean, quite possibly the vast majority would return home at the earliest opportunity once they completed their pilgrimage.
Mm-hmm.
But for many more, my understanding is like a place like Pamplona, northern Spain, Burgos, these places, they were coloured by pilgrims who were also craftsmen. So you have craftsmen throughout the kind of the known world could
Mm-hmm.
often stick around and contribute to the culture locally. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk about your pilgrimage. What got you interested in doing pilgrimages in the first place?
like I say, I've always been, from my adult life at least, a keen long distance walker. I had the privilege to grow up on the South Downs. So that was one key thing, because you had the old tracks there and the hill forts, and there's something about it that just kind of got under my skin. So I always enjoyed walking, and at some point that grafted on to long distance walking, and there was that particular experience I described in the Cotswolds and walking down to Bath. But I just always had a feeling really that if you could, it's a sort of kind of wanderlust growing up. If you could see a place on the horizon, I just had a feeling that I'd like to walk there. So there was a kind of interest in covering ground between places by foot. So it kind of as simple as that, really. And I know
So
over the
when you
years,
say you were a long distance walker prior, what type of long distance walking did you do?
yeah. So I've done various tracks throughout Britain. There's a really good book called The Long Distance Walker's Handbook, which has literally got every long distance path in Britain. So there's a lot to choose from. For me, growing up in the southeast, the South Downs Way was kind of one of my kind of modal points, maybe you could put it. So I walked up the South Downs Way a few times, and that goes from where I grew up
Mm-hmm.
along the ridge of the South Downs up to Winchester. That's one thing. I mean, years on the
And how long
road.
would that take you?
I
I'm an
mean,
American, so I
not
have no idea the
not that long. I
distance.
mean, you look at there's something like the American routes, the Appalachian Trail, and some of the other routes. I mean, they're vast, so it's like they're relatively short by comparison. But you could walk from where I was to Winchester in 5, 6, 7 days, depending on your speed. got into walking towpaths, which obviously is a different thing, but the paths along the side of canals, so they good points to connect places up. So got into
They're
doing
called
that.
towpaths.
Like canal towpaths. So
Oh.
literally, they'd have horses go. These are like industrial paths along the canals
Oh,
built in the
yeah.
19th, 18th centuries. So you'd have the paths for the horses to go along, and they'd pull the barges before
Mm-hmm.
motorised transport. And those paths are still in existence today. So they go. If you're walking in Britain, they're really good routes to follow. I mean, in general, I've tried to get a decent, a few days walking every year, and that's encompassed different things along the years.
And so this particular walk where you walk to Thomas Becket's shrine, can you talk about what's special about Thomas Becket's shrine?
Thomas Beckett Shrine. I mean, it's
And who is Thomas Beckett?
yeah, sure. Well, it's part of the history of this route, and while there are other routes I could have written about, I chose to write about this one for various reasons. I mean, one of which is that it's quite accessible. It's relatively short, so you can do it in a week, and it ties in. And for me, that kind of the story of Beckett is closely associated with it. Thomas Beckett was Chancellor and Archbishop during the reign of Henry II. So this was the 12th century, 1100s. Really fascinating story. He was Beckett and Henry were very good friends from a relatively young age. Beckett was Henry's right-hand man. At one point, Henry decided, I'm just trying to abbreviate the story, but at one point...
no, I mean, we love stories on this podcast, so tell the story.
Sure. So Beckett was Henry's chancellor. Like I say, they're very close. At one point, Henry decided to make Beckett his archbishop so that he could get his man, so to speak, in the church and have everything how he wanted it. He was quite an authoritarian figure, according to some perspectives. So Beckett became archbishop and immediately had this kind of semi-religious conversion. He said, "I'm not worthy for one office, let alone two." So he resigned the archbishopric, which he didn't even want in the first place, but was forced into it. And then this kind of story emerged. These very like these two guys. I mean, they were really good friends. And but from that point, Beckett began to feel that Henry was trying to control the church. There were all this kind of legislative things of differences between the different legislature. So Henry was trying to push one thing. Beckett felt that he was trying to control the church and therefore was a threat to, in his mind, at some point, Christianity itself. So it became very polarized. So it's this classic story of what not to do if you're trying not to polarize things. But at any rate, this went on for several years. Beckett was tried with treason. He fled to Europe. He spent a lot of time in Europe. There's always back and forth, like negotiations with the Pope. Beckett was a real thorn in Henry's side. Things were going really well for Henry, besides the story with Beckett, was creating all kinds of problems. Eventually, and I say this because this is part of a well-known story, so this isn't a particular spoiler, but it's part of the background story. It culminated. Beckett was martyred in Canterbury Cathedral. He was murdered by followers of Henry, and that kicked off the whole shrine, the whole following that emerged around Beckett. So you had this shrine in Canterbury Cathedral for hundreds of years, brought in pilgrims from all over Europe. Like I say, it was the second most important pilgrim destination in Europe at that point, and it ties in with the Pilgrim's Way. Henry took a penitential pilgrimage to Beckett Shrine. That's a long story. I mean, you could say, was he actually being that penitential? Was he more superstitious? So those are other themes I've looked at. But he is meant to. I mean, he certainly took a pilgrimage of some description. The route is uncertain, but many people put that down to the Pilgrim's Way. I mean, it's all part of the the kind of historiography of it, that, you know, the story of Beckett and Henry, there's so many different approaches you can take to it as different perspectives. It's really interesting looking into, because it's not cut and dried. You have these different ways you can interpret their story. That kind of ties into the Pilgrim's Way, because like Victorian times, Edwardian times, it's very much popularized. You had figures like Hilaire Belloc wrote about it. So there's a lot of literature associated with it. But also there's been like doubt thrown upon its veracity. Like, did that many pilgrims medieval times, did they walk it? So does it actually stand up as a historical pilgrimage route? Some think people may have walked along the South Downs and then like gone north from the kind of more easterly points in the South Downs. So you have all these questions and kind of tensions, arguably. So it was interesting to look into. And like I say, for me, I got into it, but initially I just wanted to explore and do a route that was different from the South Downs. But also, you know, it's a great introduction to pilgrimage for anyone, because it's relatively short. The going's easy. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of historical questions. It feels quite remote for this part of England, which is quite built up. You can be in places that feel quite remote. They're certainly very beautiful. It kind of feels iconic, a kind of southern English landscape. So these were some of the reasons I chose to write about this particular route.
So when you're walking along the path, and I'm guessing there's other people along the path, or are you mostly by yourself?
I mean, that route mostly by myself. It's not that well known, and I think it deserves to be better known. And it is a good one to do if you're interested in architecture. It starts and stops in cathedral cities. There's some you do. I mean, you don't see that many pilgrims on it at this point. I would say that. I mean, when you go, it skirts close to Croydon, for example. It's it's relatively close to London. You can see the city of London from there at one point. So you're quite close to built up areas. So you are walking with a fair amount of people if you're walking on a kind of weekend summer afternoon. But other times you can be walking for days and barely see a soul. So it does vary.
So what are you seeing along the way? You said the whole path is very historical. So what are you seeing on this path?
I mean, it starts off, it follows St. Swithin's Way. I mean, originally it was all the Pilgrim's Way, but in terms of modern footpaths, it goes along up St. Swithin's Way, which goes up one of the river valleys. So you have a lot of fords, a lot of low-lying meadows, lots of like, you know, kind of iconic English villages. Depending on your route, you can go into some of the more built-up areas, but generally it goes along the ridge. So you're on a kind of low chalk ridge. You're looking down over the Weald of Sussex, which is very wooded. So it's going through Hampshire. Surrey is a very wooded county in England. So pretty rural for the most part. It goes through places like Aylesford Priory, which is Carmelite Priory, which is still in use, which is quite an interesting place.
Oh.
Generally,
like there's monks there? What is
yeah,
it?
there's some Carmelite. There's an order of Carmelite monks who are still living there, and you can go there and you can stay there, and they have rooms and they have various chapels and a big outdoor church that people. I mean, the routes also people also walk it from London. That's a slightly different route. So you had Chaucer's pilgrims come down. They walk down Watling Street, the Roman road. It's now the A2, but that was originally the path that most medieval pilgrims would take if they were going through London. So that there are these various places. Generally, you're walking through woodland and downland, and it's pretty rural.
And so what are you thinking along the way? Like what were you thinking? What was going through your head as you're walking this path?
Yeah, I mean, various things. Part of the story of the book I wrote is a kind of recovery recovery from a health condition. So
Mm-hmm.
while there's different routes and walks I could have written about, this one kind of impacted on me. So that process of a walk was quite a healing experience. Different things.
Like
I
you
mean,
feel like you're getting
personally,
stronger as you're walking, or you
yeah,
just feel like
yeah.
being outside, or what is
I
it
mean,
about this? It's healing.
it's partly the process of walking. I mean, walking all day, arguably, is probably not arguably is how we're evolved to be. So there's something very
Mm.
cathartic about walking all day for days on end. That brings a real deep feeling of peace for me. So that's one thing. You're outdoors in nature, so that's huge as well. Generally camping out, so you're kind of immersed in nature for however long it is, a week at a time. So I always find that a very beneficial experience. Personally, I don't tend to walk with like MP3 players, or use my phone sparingly. So
Mm.
thinking of things that to keep your mind active, poems or songs or whatever it may be,
Mm-hmm.
and then let that kind of those preoccupations you naturally have with how far you're walking or the concerns for the day or where you're going to get water, they kind of fall into place. Or in a sense, if those are your chief concerns in terms of where you're camping or where your water's coming from,
Mm-hmm.
that puts things in perspective, really. So all the other kind of preoccupations you might have in your day-to-day life are kind of put in place.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing I'd say.
And do you ever get bored as you're walking, since you're walking for such a long amount of time?
I mean, like I say, I tend to try and have, keep my brain active. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
be that trying to memorize things or recite things I've memorized.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of most effective thing I can do. So that's one thing that keeps my mind occupied.
Did you have any revelations on your pilgrimage?
Revelations. I think it's the general experience mounts up to something in its own right. So I think arriving somewhere like Canterbury, for example, is a really beautiful experience. And the first time I'd been there was at the end of a walk. So I don't know if you could call that a revelation, but going to Canterbury Cathedral, taking part in one of the services there, that was a really profound experience. Kind of first time there, I kind of arrived on a
Can you walk
Sunday.
us through
So
that? Because I mean, I'm not familiar with Canterbury
yeah,
Cathedral.
I mean, I don't know if I'm a person to give you a history of Canterbury Cathedral, but
Not necessarily the history, but maybe just like what you saw and what was beautiful about it.
yeah, I mean, it was partly to do with the whole experience of having been on the go for days
Mm.
and arriving there. I was like, the architecture is incredible. There's something particularly about arriving in a building of that degree of magnitude when you've been sleeping in the woods for a week. It kind of puts that architecture into what you might call the kind of places architects may have been thinking of in the first instance. So, I mean, again, that was echoed getting into Bath after a few days walking. It was, a Georgian city and a late medieval abbey, but having that experience of being there after not having even been in a town for a few days, difficult to describe, but I mean, very, very profound experiences. So it's something I'd just recommend you have to give it a go. If this sounds intriguing, I'd say
Mm-hmm.
go out and experience it and see how you get on, because obviously cathedrals are popular modern tourist destinations, but to be there after that kind of experience, a few days experience walking, it just puts it on another degree of magnitude, really.
And who do you recommend doing these pilgrimages? I mean, after you tell your friends and family about this, are they intrigued? Are they wanting to do this? Are you telling people that you feel like they should be doing it?
Don't know if it's telling people it's something they should do. It's there as a choice. I think it should come as a feeling. But people, if people are interested, I'd say definitely go it. Definitely go for it, give it a go, see how you get on. I mean, for me, part of the motivation about writing about this route is that it's quite, it's relatively accessible. You can do it in a week. It's not that strenuous. You don't have to be incredibly fit to do it. So as an introduction, it's a really good one. I mean, people go on pilgrimage all around the world. There's a lot of European pilgrimages, which are great, but they're quite popular. So there's a kind of pressure there in terms of the numbers doing it. So I'd always be an advocate of looking at different options of different routes and what may be on your doorstep, or something different than kind of a few key pilgrimages that people tend to do in Europe. So so I'd say if you like the sound of it, just see how you get on, because personally I've had some great experiences.
So So what inspired you to write the book about it? Were you planning on writing it before you took the pilgrimage, or did you take the pilgrimage and get inspired?
Partly a bit of both. I don't think I've walked that route a few times. I've done it about 3 times. So I think the first time I did it, it wasn't really that conscious. I think by the time I went and read it the second or third times, I was looking with a view to writing about it more. So initially it was, like I say, it was exploring what was new territory for me, albeit like simply a change from the South Downs. So that was part of it. And I was just intrigued, really. I think when I started it, I was looking at, having been raised Christian, as so many of us have, I was looking at all those kinds of themes and questions about that, and looking for a greater understanding of that. Later, when I started the research, when I read about Henry and Beckett, their stories became incredibly pertinent with those kind of questions I was looking to explore. So yeah, it was a combination, but I think initially it was more I just wanted to do the walk, and that was my, in and of itself, rather than any research or writing about it.
And then, so how did you get into writing it? What message did you want to give to the readers, or was it more of a cathartic experience, just trying to get down on paper what it was that you did experience?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it was both those things. I was wanting to write about pilgrimage in general, and this became a really good, use that expression, vehicle to do that. Writing about this specific route, but also, it was just something that became really captivating for all these different reasons. And it became, like I say, it was tied into my experience of finding a degree of healing and getting beyond these health issues I was dealing with. So I was writing about that as well. So there's kind of a lot of things that were kind of packed into this book. But really the main thing was, what you can get out of pilgrimage, whether that be healing or, having an interest in history or exploring landscapes. They all kind of tied into one, really, in a way that I'd struggled to separate. And for me, it became a means to do a little bit more research about English history and our own history, and some of our cultural roots. So it just became very appealing, and it felt like something that would bring me to a greater understanding of things I was trying to really look at quite pertinently in my own life.
And you said you were asking yourself questions along the way. Can you talk a little bit about the questions you were grappling with, and if you came to any answers?
I think the chief one, and it's something I haven't gone into in this interview, but I mean, I was raised Christian. I got really into Druidry in a big way in my late teens. That's part of the reason I went on the road, took part in different campaigns. That was a big part of my kind of personal story. Somewhere along the way, I felt the need to look at more specifically about my upbringing, how I felt about Christianity, looking at my relationship with that. So that's something I have come to conclusions with during the course of the book. I'm not sure I want to use this interview to talk about that specifically, but that was a major
But you talk
theme.
about it in your book.
Yeah, and also like writing about Beckett's life and he didn't have a religious conversion. He was already Christian, but it was a kind of amplification of his faith. You look at his story. I mean, he's a really interesting figure, and he had time in exile in these abbeys and monasteries in France when he was getting away from Henry's influence. And he was a very pious figure. He was renowned for his piety, but also that was taken to extremes. He was doing things like immersing himself in freezing cold streams in the middle of winter and ending up hallucinating that he was having an audience with the Pope, albeit kind of, accosted by a host of fairies, stuff like that. So that was really interesting. And for me, looking at his story became a really interesting mechanism, if you like, to talk about, to look at Christianity kind of with its boons, but also some of the things maybe you have to watch out for if you take anything too far. So that was interesting. And then like Henry, conversely, had another narrative of his. He was very, I don't know if you could say he was power hungry, but he liked to be in control, and that was almost part of his undoing, if it was an undoing. So you had those twin themes of their story and the power and the piety and things to watch out for, but also finding the things which are of value. I mean, maybe not so much in Henry's story, but in terms of Beckett's story, the things that are of value within that. So those were some of the things I was looking at as I did this walk. So.
Well, are there any, other history lessons that you learned about on your pilgrimage, or stories that you want to share with us?
There's various stories. I might spare you some of them.
Well, maybe pick an interesting one.
Yeah. Good question. There was it's one of those things. Some stories, when you start, I might be here for quite a long time, so I'll choose my next words carefully. God, that's a really good question. I don't know really. At this stage, I'll say that it was the general accumulative experience of doing those routes, and also things like, for example, looking at some of the political issues with the modern day church and finishing that pilgrimage, being received into that environment by a female Christian pastor, part of the Church of England, obviously, and praying with her at Beckett's tomb. I mean, that was a really profound experience. So if I could take one thing away, that would be one of the key things of that kind of resolution of historical conflicts. So that's definitely one thing I could say.
Well, thank you so much. This was such a fascinating topic. I mean, like I said before, I didn't really have a lot of experience with pilgrimages, but it's definitely something I would be interested in doing at a later point. Maybe
That's
not
great.
with my young
That's
children.
Yeah. Well,
I think they would complain a lot.
I have met people on pilgrimage routes who have walked it with their families.
Oh, yeah?
With varying degrees of enthusiasm amongst their children.
Right,
but,
yes.
as you can imagine.
Varying degrees.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, if I can inspire anyone anywhere to get out walking and be it a walk or a pilgrimage, that's really great. So,
Well, fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on.
thank
And
you.
thanks so much, Folksources, for joining us on our podcast pilgrimage today. All of the notes that we have talked about, and we'll put a link to your book that is currently in funding stages. Is that right? On the Indiegogo. We'll put it on our website, which is www.fabricoffolklore.com. And any other links that you have that you want to add on there, we can do that so people can get in touch with you if they want to talk with you. And so, listeners, if you've been inspired to do your own pilgrimage, please let us know. Where do you want to go? Where have you thought about going? Let us know on our Facebook podcast group, and just tell us what you've been thinking about while listening to this podcast. And make sure you subscribe, like, and follow, and give us all the stars on iTunes, because those 5 seconds that you take to give us 5 stars or give us a little review really help the computer algorithms point other people to our podcast so that we can continue on this podcast journey, learning about ourselves and other cultures, to make us better human beings, like I said before. And the best thing that you can do is share with your friends and family. So if you are inspired, you can write a poem and go to a slam poetry contest and tell everyone about this awesome Fabric of Folklore podcast. So until next time, keep the folk alive.